Hi there. This is Professor Ewing again, and we're going to take a look at the PowerPoint under Judaism. There are two PowerPoints that I have in that unit with the little intro that I wrote. The one that we're going to be looking at in this video is called Abraham and Moses, and it really looks at the background and the sources of early Israelite religion. The other PowerPoint is called simply Judaism or Judaism, and that will cover contemporary Judaism, its belief system, and some of its practices and holy days, etc. This one I put in some imagery, and so we'll take a look at some ways that the Patriarch Abraham has been depicted, as well as the lawgiver Moses, as he's referred to in Judaism, the lawgiver Moses, the lawgiver, or generically the prophet Moses. Although obviously in Judaism he's held in high esteem as the one who not only delivered the Israelite slaves from bondage in Egypt, the Israelite tribes, but also after their deliverance received the covenant, the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, and delivered these commandments to the people. So in a sense, in traditional Jewish views, Moses becomes Yahweh's secretary, Yahweh Elohim, the God of the Israelites, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So let's take a look. If you open up the PowerPoint called Abraham and Moses, the first slide simply refers to Abraham as the father of faith. And it's important to emphasize that Abraham is revered in the monotheistic traditions, sometimes referred to as the Abrahamic traditions or Abrahamic religions, taking upon themselves his name, specifically of Judaism, and then Christianity and Islam, historically speaking. There are other Abrahamic religions. Some of them no longer historically exist. There was a group called the Mandaeans that are referred to in the Quran, and some of the early Christian sources, and they seem to have been originally at least followers or disciples of John the Baptist. They practiced a form of baptism or immersion, and yet they were not Christian. So they're an interesting group. There were various sects of Judaism at the time of Jesus of Nazareth, and we'll talk about that in detail when we deal with him and when we deal with Christianity. But also the Baha'i faith, which is a relatively new tradition coming out of Persia, or what would now be considered the modern country of Iran in the Middle East. Their prophet Baha'u'llah, coming out of the Shiite Muslim context in the middle 1800s. The Baha'is are fairly widespread throughout the world. Typically, I have a guest speaker who comes from that tradition at the end of the semester and talks a little bit about how the Baha'is see themselves as a monotheistic religion or an Abrahamic religion alongside of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So they're interesting, but we won't cover them obviously in this short lecture. Now, if you look at the illustration here, This is a close-up of a famous painting done by the Dutch painter Rembrandt in 1635. He's post-Renaissance, Northern European, referred to as a Dutch artist, what would now be the contemporary country of the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And he was a brilliant painter, a Christian in the Protestant tradition, and he does a lot of biblical scenes from the New Testament, scenes of Jesus, etc. But a lot of Old Testament scenes or Jewish Bible, Hebrew Bible scenes. And this is one of his more famous representations he does of the Patriarch Abraham. You can see he's got a lot of emotion in Abraham's face. And this is a still, essentially, that he captures from the 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, covering not only the creation accounts and the story of the patriarchs, Noah, etc., but later dealing with Abraham and his sons and grandsons, etc., as the progenitor of not only the Israelites but the Ishmaelites. And the Prophet Muhammad traces his lineage through Arabian tribes back through Ismail or Ishmael, the firstborn son of Abraham to Hagar, the Egyptian handmaiden of Abraham's wife Sarah. His son from Sarah, his wife Sarah, was referred to as Yitzhak or Isaac. And that's what you're seeing depicted here from the 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis. A very bizarre story on the surface. After Isaac comes of age, he's portrayed here as a young lad, probably about bar mitzvah age, 12 or 13. And Abraham is commanded by the voice of God, by God, to take his son and sacrifice him on a mountain. And so you're seeing the setting here, the wood for the burnt offering. There's a blade, obviously he's going to cut Isaac's throat here and offer him up as a sacrifice. And then you see the hand of the angel restraining Abraham. And if you read the narrative in Genesis chapter 22, there's a lot of psychological tension in this story. It's a very interesting story. The angel essentially tells Abraham not to follow through with offering his son as a sacrifice, that God in a sense was testing him, testing his faith to see if he would offer up his precious son Isaac. You can see a ram in the background. The horn is caught in the thicket, and the angel provides that as the substitution, and then Isaac and Abraham offer up the ram as a sacrifice to God as thanksgiving. And so there's a lot going on in this narrative. Very interesting. But the ultimate point, I think, or at least one of the ultimate points in the story, is that Abraham was faithful, and therefore he's referred to as the father of faith, and he becomes the model in all three of these religions. In Judaism, he becomes the model of the Israelite nation in how to follow the divine will and to be unswerving in their observance of God's commandments. And so Abraham becomes the model for Jews and for Judaism. He's also revered highly in Christianity, in the Christian Bible, in the Christian portion of the Bible, I should say, the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, who himself was a converted Jewish rabbi to the early Christian movement, speaks very highly of his ancestor Abraham in his letter to the Galatians, especially in chapter 4, although he brings up Abraham quite a bit throughout his writings, at least the writings that are contained in the New Testament. And he says something very radical for a Jew. The Jews prided themselves on being descendants of the Israelites, right? Being direct descendants of Abraham through Isaac and through Isaac's son Jacob. And the Apostle Paul says, how do you become, in a sense, an offspring of Abraham, or a son of Abraham, inclusively sons and daughters of Abraham? And that is, you have the faith of Abraham, the Apostle Paul says. And those that have the faith of Abraham, they're willing to follow God's word and God's teachings, can call themselves genuinely the offspring of Abraham, or his sons, in a sense. So that's a very radical, inclusive statement to make by someone coming out of a Jewish context. In Islam, Ibrahim, the Arabic form of the Hebrew name of Abraham, is also very highly revered, especially in the Quran, the revelation, God's revelation to Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad. In that tradition, he's referred to in many places throughout the Quran, in at least 35 of the various surahs or chapters. And he's referred to by certain praiseworthy epithets. He's viewed as a model Muslim, i.e. as one who submits to the will of Allah, or God's will. He's referred to as Hanif, a straight person, someone who's not deceptive in his dealings with others, and someone who's upright and righteous, a monotheist, right, not worshiping anything in the place of God. And so Abraham becomes sort of the prototypical Muslim, what it means to submit to God's will. Let's move on here. The next page, I have a couple more iconic representations of the Patriarch Abraham. The one on your right is an Eastern Orthodox or a Greek Orthodox Christian icon of Abraham. Notice that the angel's descending from heaven here, and Abraham's depicted by this Eastern Christian artist with a halo or an aura signifying his holiness, his righteousness. And you notice that the angel also has an aura, and he's got the blade up to Isaac's throat here, and he's already got the altar, the wood of the altar burning for the burnt offering. So that's significant. If you look at the illustration on the left, this comes from a Persian Muslim miniature, and this, I like this a lot, but this one, Ibrahim is seen holding the forelock of his son's hair. Now, there's some debate amongst the early Islamic commentators as to which son Abraham sacrificed. Of course, in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis chapter 22, the son is specifically named as Isaac. In the Quran, the son is not specifically named when this is made reference to, but later it's popularly understood that it's his firstborn son, Ismail or Ishmael. Some of the early Islamic commentators, though, say it could have been Isaac, could have been Ishmael, but the point of the story is that it doesn't really matter which of the sons. It's the point that he was faithful to the divine will. He submitted, and he was willing to sacrifice his son. And so you can see the angel is depicted here again with wings. But I like this one because the angel is not just telling Abraham not to sacrifice his son, but he's also providing the ram, the sacrifice here. So very interesting. 3 historic monotheistic faiths. They all revere Abraham as the model of faith, what it means to be faithful to God, even in the face of adversity. But they all look at him in a different light. In Judaism, Abraham is viewed primarily as the patriarch, as the ancestor blessed by God because of his faithfulness to inhabit a land of promise. And you can see that I have some references here in Genesis chapter 17 and then in Genesis chapter 18. In those verses, the covenant is established with Abraham. Christianity sees this, but further than this, they talk about the seed of Abraham, and that's interpreted in a messianic way by the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 3. And he sees that the birth of Jesus Christ, the Messiah or the Christ, is the fulfillment of the promise and the covenant that was originally established with Abraham. So that's a Christian interpretation of the story of Abraham. Islam sees Abraham and his son Ismail as a founder of the Kaaba shrine in Mecca, or at least the reformer of the Kaaba shrine, the one who builds the monument at a time of polytheism in honor of the one true God. And here are some references in the Quran, Surah number 2 and Surah number 3, and they speak very highly of Abraham as the upright, as in a sense a true Muslim, one who submits to the divine will. And you can see here I've put in an English translation of a verse from the Quran, Surah 22. He, i.e. God or Allah, has chosen you and has not laid upon you hardship in religion, the faith of your father Abraham. So this is tying in the revelation given to Muhammad, i.e. the Quran. It's tying that revelation in with the faith of his father, his ancestor Abraham there. If you go to the next slide, this is a satellite map of what we would call the Fertile Crescent. And the red line, if you pay attention to the red line, is simply based upon the chronology and the places that Abraham sojourns through in his journey from ancient Babylon through Nineveh in the north, Haran, down into the region called Hebron. Jerusalem doesn't exist at the time of Abraham as an Israelite city, at least. And so the region of Hebron is mentioned as the burial place of Abraham's wife Sarah, and that probably has some relation to the word Hebrew, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit here. And then of course he ventures down into Egypt and has some dealings with the Pharaoh, and ends up in this region here called Hebron, where he dies. And in the contemporary state of Israel and the Palestinian territories, there's a place called the Cave of the Patriarchs, where Abraham is his remains are said to be there by tradition. So if you touch on the link I have here, it simply takes you to a Wikipedia photo of the contemporary city of Urfa in Turkey, or the ancient city of Edessa, and the pool of Abraham. And there are some oral traditions that focus him in that area. The pool of fish, which is now the pool in front of a mosque in contemporary city of Urfa in southeastern Turkey. And so that's interesting. If you touch on that link, you'll see a contemporary photo of the pool of fish associated with miracles ascribed orally, at least in oral tradition, to the Patriarch Abraham as he was sojourning through this region. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about Judaism and about Moses. And let me go ahead and conclude this first video here so it doesn't get too long as far as uploading, and then I'll start the second video and we'll talk about Judaism, Moses, a little bit about the Ten Commandments. Okay.